Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading Adam of the Road, and I'm going to begin Chapter 9, Night in Westhumble Lane. And the picture is a picture of Jenkin on the horse Baynard that he won in a gambling game from Roger. For the rest of that day and all the next it rained. They walked southwest over the low-lying meadows and fields and woodland of the Thames Valley, with the rain pattering steadily in their faces. It was the time of grain harvest, but nobody could work in the fields in this downpour. Where the grain had already been cut, flocks of lapwings with black belts hunted about for food among the scarlet poppies in the stubble. In the villages, men went from stable to barn with sacking over their heads or stood in the shelter of doorways to talk. Adam's green hood with its short cape kept his head and shoulders fairly dry, and the harp that bulged in the middle of his back, but by the second afternoon his legs were wet to the knees and his shoes squelched at every step. Nick was soaked too. The light hair on his stomach was dark mud-colored. All the feathers on his legs were like dripping rat tails. He plodded along with his head low, and now and then he stopped and shook himself violently, sending a muddy shower all over Adam. "Nick never thinks of going off by himself to shake," grumbled Adam, wiping his cheek with the back of his hand. "Watch out!" cried Roger. They both jumped to the road's edge, just as a man on horseback clattered round the curve behind them, and without slackening his pace, pounded down the road ahead. His horse's hoofs splashed up mud in blobs. Nick took off after the horse, and Adam, almost breathless with surprise shock, called him back. "Oh, best put him on a leash," said Roger. "He's been trained to follow Bayard, and he might go on doing it from force of habit." "Was that Bayard?" "Bayard it was, and Master Jenkins showing off for all he was worth. Well away, I wish we had Bayard now. His iron shoes would save our leather ones on these muddy roads. Can you hold out a few minutes further? There's an inn at Burford Bridge where we can lie tonight." "Ho," said Adam stoutly, "I could walk 10 miles more." It would be fun to spend the night at an inn. Last night they'd slept at Merton Priory on the River Wandle. They'd been comfortable there, and Adam had thought it good to hear again the bells ringing for Compline, Matins, and Prime, and the monks' voices chanting the services. But there had been no one in the little guest house but themselves and 2 sleepy peddlers who cared nothing for minstrelsy. Nick indicated by bracing his 4 feet suddenly that he did not think it was fair to be leashed on a county road. Adam pulled him along, sitting down until the sight of the collar around Nick's ears and the alarmed but determined look in Nick's eyes melted his never stony heart. "There," he said, and undid the thing. Nick rewarded him with a brisk shower of mud and trotted off to the roadside with one ear turned up over his head. "What kind of folk will there be at the inn tonight?" said Adam. "Oh, pilgrims perhaps going to Canterbury, or merchants going to the fair at Winchester." Now, I'm going to pause here and make sure you understand. When we talk about pilgrims, we're talking about the pilgrims in New England and Thanksgiving very often. But these pilgrims, and they are in many ways the same, are religious people who are on a pilgrimage, which means they are praying all along the road and stopping at churches and praying, and usually there's one main goal, like the cathedral in Canterbury, where they will be going for worship. So it's a religious journey on foot usually. Whereas our pilgrims, it was also a religious journey, but the pilgrimage was not to a specific holy place, but to go to a place where they could worship in comfort. Okay. "What tales shall we tell them?" "Well," answered Roger slowly, "which one do you think they'd like best?" Adam thought a bit as he splashed along in the rain, jumping a puddle here and straddling one there. "Not a French one, I shouldn't think," he answered at last, "'cause why, There wouldn't be knights and ladies in an inn, and they're the ones that like the stories about love and chivalry. I'm tired of Sir Orfeo and Floris and Blanchefleur and Aucassin and Nicolette anyway. I don't want to hear about any more ladies leaving little bunches of flowers in the forest for their lovers to find them by. Let's tell King Horn and have some good shipwrecks." Roger laughed. "There speaks an Englishman," he said. "We shall tell King Horn, and in English, no French at Burford Bridge." So that tells us that Roger and Adam are of English descent. They are Anglo-Saxons, not Normans like the Delisles are. The road had been going steadily uphill for some time, for they were on the long, gradual slope that led to the chalky ridge called the North Downs. Yew trees grew black and gloomy against the rain-filled sky. The soft, wet wind blew without ceasing. A magpie, very big and black and white, flashed across the road in front of them. "One for sorrow," said Roger half to himself. "Two for mirth," answered Adam quickly. "We'll see another one in a minute. You watch that side of the road and I'll watch this." Now, this is just a funny little thing that people do. I can remember a time when anytime you saw a VW Beetle, you would punch the person next to you, and they were called punch buggies. Well, this one is every time you see a magpie. One is for sorrow, and when you see two, then you'll have happiness. It's a way of bonding with the people, your traveling companions. He could not bear to think of sorrow when they were so happy. Even wet, even footsore, they were happy. His quick eyes saw a rabbit sitting up on its hind legs among the ferns. They saw a man with a cow far down the road ahead. They saw a lark rise out of the field. They forgot to look for the second magpie. I'm wondering if that's foreshadowing that something bad is going to happen. Presently, the road went steeply downhill. At the bottom lay the River Mole, and the stone bridge, and a cluster of houses and a church. Roger went straight to the little inn in Westhumble Lane, which had a moon and stars painted in the signboard that swung and creaked in the rain. The innkeeper's wife, whose name was Clarice, took Adam in charge at once. She was a spidery, active little woman with bright black eyes. She had 2 maids and a man and a boy working for her, not to mention her husband. She flung out orders like blows, and they all, Adam noticed, dodged them as if they had been blows. "Fetch me a bucket from the well," she commanded. "Bring me a towel and turn the cake on the hearth. I smell it burning. Poor boy, mud from head to feet. See, that man in the front room doesn't get away without paying. A scrubbing, that's what you need, and dry clothing. Can you play that harp? A little fellow like you? Stir the pottage, Maud. We've minstrels in the house tonight." She is an active person. For a moment, Adam, smarting over being called a little fellow, was afraid she was going to strip him and scrub him then and there in the crowded kitchen, but she didn't. Roger got the bucket from the well, and Dame Clarice herself came for the towel. Then she showed them a shed in the stable yard where they could wash in privacy. While she bustled off to turn the cake herself and collect money from the man in the front room and stir the pottage as it ought to be stirred. Adam and Roger bathed and put on extra clothes, which were in Roger's bag. Adam, who was dressed first, took their wet garments into the kitchen, which, with the firelight and the fragrance of good food cooking, was a cheerful place on the rainy afternoon. A baby lay in the wooden cradle. Its very young, red-cheeked mother sat beside it with a distaff and spindle, and with steady twisting fingers made the bunch of wool on the distaff into the thread wound on the spindle. They were making thread. A young man brought in a pail of milk and stopped to tickle the baby's chin with his big horny forefinger. A maid came in to get bread and cheese from a cupboard and went out again. Dame Clarice bustled about with a long iron spoon in her hand, which seemed to be equally useful for stirring the pot and nudging people out of her way. Adam spread out their wet clothes on a bench in front of the fire, then sat down beside them to see that they did not scorch. His shoes he put on the hearth and tucked his feet in their cloth hose under him. Nick lay down on his back on the hearth and waved his feet comfortably in the warm glow. "How old are you, boy?" A voice from the corner made Adam jump. He had not seen the old man who sat there. He was a very old man. His hair was white, and the wrinkles around his frosty blue eyes looked as if they had been made in parchment, but there was a kind of shine in his smile. "I'm 11, said Adam. "I was just about as big as you when King John signed the charter at Runnymede 79 years ago. I lived down the road a bit near Reigate Castle. My father was Hayward on the Lord's domain. Do you know what a Hayward is, Londoner?" "Yes, sir. He sees the hedges are mended and keeps the cows and sheep out of the grain and people too." Dame Clarice took up Adam's cloak, shook it briskly, and put it back down. "Gaffer is always at it," she said, telling about his boyhood to anyone that has time to listen. "Let me tell the lad," persisted the old man irritably. "He'll like it. His mind isn't on cooking." "Oh, please tell me, sir," said Adam politely, remembering the proverb of Alfred that his father had taught him. "If you sit upon the bench and see before you standing a trembling old man, get up from your seat and bid him sit down. Then will he say, 'A good man taught you first.' Then sit backward beside him and learn wisdom." "I was a wild boy," said the old gaffer. "I knew every bush and stump and stone, and I knew the cave under the castle courtyard. I knew the barons were meeting in secret all through May that year. Earl William was thought to be the king's man, but he was meeting there with these others in the cave beneath the courtyard." Adam really listened, now that it was a matter of caves. "Then one day," the old man went on, "a man came stamping through the north barley field, and my father blew his horn and stopped him. He would have taken his hood or his gloves from him in penalty for tramping through the Lord's grain, but that he showed the badge of a king's messenger. He could take any shortcut he wanted. But my father was angry. All that barley stomped down, and no more than a quarter of a mile saved by his shortcut. But he could do nothing." "What happened next?" asked Adam, caring nothing for the barley. "Well, I ran quick to the entrance to the cave and told the squire on guard that the messenger was coming. He didn't stop to ask how I got there. He ran. When the messenger reached the castle, there was Earl William in the solar reading to his lady." "What was the message?" "That I don't know, but it wasn't long after that the barons left, not all at once and not openly. Earl William rode out last of all. Then we heard that they met the king at Runnymede and forced him to sign the charter. He said afterward that he signed it under duress, so it didn't bind him. But King John is dead these many years. May God have mercy on his soul. And the freedom the great charter won for us lives in England, for us lives in England still. It was a day early in June that the messenger came. I'm nearly 90 now, but I've never forgotten it. Keep your eyes open, boy. You may see big things happening." "Yes, sir," said Adam, his eyes shining. He had no idea what the great charter might be, but he thought of barons meeting in a cave and a boy of his own age running to warn them set every nerve in his body to tingling. "The boy's a minstrel," scolded Dame Clarice, coming back with her spoon to stir again. "You should let him tell the tales." "Oh, all the adventures don't happen in minstrels' tales. Let the boy keep his eyes open. He may see great things happen, though he doesn't know it at the time. Now I've done." He had done too. He folded his wrinkled hands over his stomach, closed his eyes, and went to sleep. Adam put his shoes on silently and stole away from the fire, which had become too hot. He found Roger in the front room, perched on the edge of a bed, talking to a chapman who was sitting on the trunk, wringing out his wet hood and grumbling about the weather. Gradually, the inn filled up. Beside the chapman, there were 2 merchants with pack horses and servants, and 2 fellows of a college at Oxford with their servants and horses, and a carpenter who had been on the pilgrimage to Canterbury and had a little lead picture of St. Thomas sewn in his cap. Dame Clarice was busier than ever, and even her lazy helpers bestirred themselves. Everybody wanted supper at the same time. The chapman and the carpenter had bread and cheese and ale. The merchants had hot spiced wine and meat with the savory sauce. The clerks from Oxford had bread and beef and gravy and ale. Adam and Roger had bread and pottage, and very good it was too. The bread was made of flour from the new wheat just harvested. Bread always tastes best in August, Adam thought, partly because it really was so good and sweet and fresh, and partly because the bread in July, made what was left from last year's flour, was often musty and sour. When they had eaten, Roger nodded to Adam, and he drew his fingers over his harp strings. One of the clerks leaned back against the wall, crossed his legs. "Minstrels," he said to his companion. "Good. I'm not ready to sleep, and we can't read unless we pay for candles." The room was dim with the rain and the gathering dark. Dame Clarice's man came in with a torch, which he set in the holder on the stone wall. It gave a wavering and murky light that fell on Roger's face, making deep caverns of his eyes and little shadowed hollows under his cheekbones. "Listen, lordlings," he began, and paused, while Dame Clarice and her daughter and the maids and the men came into the room. Then he went on. "Hearken, wives and maidens and all men, to my story of Murray, king of the western land, and his son Horn. Sun never shone and rain never rained on a fairer lad. He was bright as glass and ruddy and brave, and when my tale begins, he was 15 winters old. He had 12 companions, all rich men's sons, and all fair lads." Adam thought of Hugh and Godfrey and the rest, and of Perkin. Wouldn't they open their eyes if they could see him now? It was on a summer day that Murray, the good king, rode by the seaside with 2 of his knights. There he saw 15 ships come sailing right to the shore. The ships were full of Saracens. If you recall, those would be Muslims or Arabs. They slew Murray and put the queen to flight. They took Horn and his companions prisoners. Their leaders spoke. "Horn, you are tall and shining. In 7 years you will grow still bigger. If we let you and your companions live, you may kill us all. Therefore you must put to sea in a ship. And if the ship sinks to the bottom and drowns you, everyone, we shall not regret it." The ship and the story were launched. Adam listened, as if he did not know every turn of it. Roger never told it quite the same way. Sometimes he dwelt on Horn's love for the Princess Rimenhild, sometime on his friendship with Atholf. This time it was the sea he dwelt on, and the storms, and the ships that sailed over it. When he reached the fight between Horn and the pagan knight, he stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Good friends," he said, "give me some reward for my art, and I will continue." So he's left them with a cliffhanger, which is what that's called when you haven't finished the story. In this case, he expects to be paid to finish the story. Adam snatched off his cap and went with it from one person to another. One merchant put in half of a silver penny. The other hesitated. But when Adam made Nick stand up and ask for it, he laughed and threw in a penny. The clerks from Oxford gave a penny between them. The chapman shook his head. The carpenter left the room. The inn servants grinned, and Dame Clarice said, "A bed's my gift, even though I can't throw it in the cap," so they get to stay at the inn without having to pay rent for their bed. Roger went on with his tale. Before it was finished, Jankin came in. He looked pale in the torchlight, and his mouth had a bitter droop to it. He called for ale and supped it noisily, and when Roger had come to the end of the tale, he called out, Your tail limps like my horse, minstrel. He actually said your horse, minstrel, but we know that it's really his horse that had once belonged to the minstrel. My horse never limped when I rode him, snapped Roger. Have you lamed him galloping like mad over steep roads? He's lame, said Jenkins shortly. I thought to be in Guilford tonight, but I have to come back, the horse limping and I walking. More ale, dame. Bayard lame. Won from them and ridden carelessly and lamed. Roger and Adam went to bed in heavy silence. Several beds in the room were already filled, but the one nearest the door was left for them. Adam took off his surcoat and his shoes and scrambled over the straw to the far side. Straw and coverlet were both thin, but they were clean and dry too, and Roger was there beside him. He hung his hand over the edge of his bed, and Nick, who had curled up on the floor, licked it softly. Oh, poor Bayard, thought Adam, cupping his palm around Nick's muzzle. Then he pressed his fingers lightly on Nick's moist, cool nose and scratched a little the silky hollow between his eyes. Nick licked his hand again, and he pulled it back into bed because the last kiss had been a little too wet. He could not know that he was saying goodbye to Nick. Well, speaking of cliffhangers, that's a cliffhanger too. So what does that mean? He was saying goodbye to Nick and he didn't know it. What do you think happens with Nick? Well, we'll find out later in the next chapter, perhaps. But I did want to remind you that maybe your book is like my book and it has a map in the front of it. And we started out at St. Albans Abbey, and then we went down to London, and they stayed at the Merton's Priory. If you recall, he said it was just monks. And then now we're here at Burford Bridge. We've got a lot of journeying yet to do, and we're only about halfway through the book. So we'll find out what happens to Nick and more about their journeys. Bye-bye.